Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the official online launch of The Great Man Is Dead, my new book, A New Philosophy for Leadership. What I thought I'd do is, because this is not a standard sort of a standard book launch in the way you would usually do things when we can get together, is I thought I would step through the content of the book, but actually more importantly try to bring to life the stories that sit behind it and some of the theories that I've really focused on and where those theories have come from. Because I think that for anybody who picks up The Great Man Is Dead, what you'll start to realize is that it's absolutely not intended to be a standard leadership book in the form that you usually pick up from the shelf. And what I mean by that is, over the years, I've read so many different books, as you can kind of see behind me, and a lot of those leadership books that I've read tend to be based on stories of some type of heroic figure telling us how we should lead and how we should live our lives. And what I noticed from them is that what they did is they created this momentary spike of inspiration for us. Is wow, that's amazing! Look at what that person did. But you kind of always struggled to reconcile it back to your own life. There were things that you could take, but it always left you feeling like, for the people I spoke to about it, like you're inadequate relative to those heroes. And so The Great Man Is Dead is not that type of book. It's more a book about you and for you as a human being, which I'll explain a lot more as we go through. In terms of this webinar, and I'm also on Instagram Live, is please feel free to ask questions. Get involved in the conversation on the webinar. There is a chat function and there's a Q&A. Please feel free to pipe up with any questions that you've got. We could try and make this as interactive as you can make these things. So I guess for me, what The Great Man Is Dead is really all about is this concept that the time of the hero leader is over. Okay, and what I mean by that is that I think for years, for millennia, the myth of the leader has been this individual who is the all-seeing, all-knowing, heroic character that's going to basically save the world and fix all of our problems. But actually, as we know for ourselves, and especially in recent history through the COVID crisis, that character just doesn't exist. It's not real, and it is exactly as I called it, a myth. And instead of that, actually, what The Great Man Is Dead is doing is trying to put to one side this myth of the hero leader, and instead say, actually, it is now the age of the human leader. As human beings ourselves, we have this expectation that we'll be treated like human beings and we'll be recognised for our individuality and the choices that we want to make for our lives. And in fact, it's not just an expectation; it's a demand now. We're demanding it so much more and expecting and demanding that from our employers, from the institutions that we work with and through all life. And I think that, the more you see trends around big protests, whether that be, in regards to Black Lives Matters was a great example of it, where people are just no longer prepared to put up with the classic institutions that have ruled for many years, and instead they want a more human approach that embraces all of our humanity. So for me, what the Great Man Is Dead is all about is this concept of, let's put to bed finally, let's kill off the great man model, the hero leader, and let's instead focus on being a human being leading and supporting other human beings. Before I get into some of the rest of the content, let me give you a bit of an introduction to me. Who is Rob Cross and where does some of this come from? And so, as you can probably tell from my accent, although I'm now living in the UK with my family, I was actually bizarrely born in the UK but grew up in Australia. And through my time in Australia, I grew up in a small country town. And I found that I was always slightly different from the other kids. And that difference was one of a real curiosity about life, about how the world works, and a curiosity about how people worked. And for those people on the webinar, you'll see some images of me as I grew up. Some of my first real seminal leadership experiences was in Scouts, where you're this little young boy, young child leading other young children. And some of the lessons I learned from there about how people tick and how to get the best out of people really set the path for me for my leadership going forwards. And then clearly I went through to eventually join the military, where where that was a real shock to me, because I think a large part of the military was still based on this great man model that was overt in terms of the stripes that people had on their shoulders, and I really struggled with some aspects of that, which I'll share more of. In following that sort of early childhood, I then went into the corporate world, as many people do. Although I studied civil engineering and started my life as an engineer in the Australian Air Force, actually I never worked as an engineer, and instead followed a path of being really curious about how organisations worked and how people led organisations and led them effectively. And so rather than working as a classic sort of graduate technical engineer, I sort of followed this path and eventually ended up leading consulting teams and then moving into big corporates when I moved to the UK in 2004, where my focus was really on helping leaders and their teams really unlock potential. And that was everything from classic sort of change management type roles through to leadership and talent management, and then eventually into operational HR role, where I was an HR director of a significant part of a company. And throughout that time, I guess I spent the last 20 years really traveling the world, helping leaders and their teams. And as you'll read in the book, I'd like to say I was brilliant at it. I think I was okay, and I used to get some good feedback. But in actual fact, the thing that I really struggled with is I struggled to reconcile between the theories that I was being told were important, which were fundamentally the great man theory of leadership, and what really worked and what really helped leaders and helped human beings unlock their own potential. And I guess what really happened, post that, what kind of sits on my CV is that I had a range of quite deep experiences that stopped me in my tracks in life and caused me to think differently about how humans work. And that's where the core theory of the human dilemmas and the three questions come from. And for the people on the webinar, you'll see the images. The first image of sort of three characters, that's me as a 25-year-old. And within a few months of this photo being taken, the guy on the right-hand side, Neil, died suddenly, early 40s, no rhyme or reason for it, had an aneurysm, left 4 daughters behind. And then 7 years later, the guy in the middle, who was my best friend, the person I was probably closest to in life, died suddenly, and left me in a state of complete shock. I didn't know how to deal with it, and how to not only deal with the grief, but also how to make sense of this fact that I've got a photo of 3 of us and I'm the only one left. And what that particular incident took me on is it took me on a journey to say, hang on, life doesn't make any sense. Human beings don't make any sense. What does this all mean? What does it, how do I really use this as a way of helping other people? And ironically, a mentor of mine at the time introduced me to existential therapy, which existential philosophy, and existential psychotherapy, which really forms the foundation of the theory that I'm going to talk about. Beyond that, though, that tragedy of the experience of losing people who are close to you, I also had this with my wife. The middle picture of my 2 children, or our 2 children, I should say, and I don't think you can love anything more than you love a child, albeit they are immensely frustrating and testing of you and challenging every aspect of your own sense of identity and your leadership. And for me, those 2 experiences took me on a journey that stopped me and made me think, hang on, everybody's got a story. All of these human beings that I'm working with and I've spent time with over the last 20 years, having a story that may not be equivalent to mine as in the same content, but they all have a story that forms their sense of identity and purpose. And the final point that really helped me unlock the true potential of sort of the model that I worked with was the final image around Tom. And Tom, unfortunately, he and I were on a coaching course together, and we became really close. He was one of the most learned individuals I've met, really inspiring guy. And in the middle of that, kind of lost himself through a range of experiences that he was having, and eventually committed suicide. And again, the tragedy of that, trying to reconcile how would such a fabulous individual decide to make that decision, I just couldn't make sense of. But what all of this does, and I don't tell that story lightly in terms of the experiences that I've had and what shaped me, but it calls me to stop and recognize that, ultimately, beyond everything else, all of our diversity, all the stuff that we're told we should celebrate, is that we are each human beings, and we are surrounded by other human beings, and we are human beings in all of the magnificence and vulnerability that's contained within that. And the more I understood that, the more I created that as the foundation of a new philosophy for leadership. The more I recognize that as human beings, we want something different for our lives and for the lives of those people around us. And the more I found that we could dissect that and understand it and create a model around it so people could really embrace it, the more effective I think we can be in terms of unlocking our own potential and the potential of others. And so if that's my story, where that led me to is to create this concept of Meru Leadership, which is the business that I run, and the initiative that I use to help other people around the world. And Meru Leadership, Meru comes from Aboriginal language, and the term Meru stands for path or pathway. And the foundations of what I do and the people I work with, it's all about recognizing that the journey that we're on is as important as the destination. And the more we can learn to enjoy that journey, the more we can redefine what success and fulfillment mean to us, and the more we can let go of the great man model and instead just focus on who we are and what we're all about. And more importantly, get some really clear definition of that, which is ultimately what The Great Man Is Dead, my new book, is all about. So let's leap into the book and let me explain it a bit more. So The Great Man Is Dead is about this individual, which I call the squeezed middle, and I've borrowed that terminology from one of the people that I work with. And the concept of the squeezed middle is that, it's the people in life who are caught in this middle ground where you've got all the pressures that life throw at you, and those pressures include, aging parents, where all of a sudden you're having to redefine your role in the family and start to shift where the care goes to and from. You've often got young children or other dependencies that you have around you that you've got to pay attention to and invest time and energy in. And at the same time, you've got yourself, yourself in terms of your ambitions, your drives, the things you want to achieve for your life and with your life. And then the other wonderful things that we pile on around us, around pressures of mortgages, bills, all that kind of stuff. And the more people I work with, whilst it may not be sort of overpowering for them, actually feel that pressure quite intensely. And bizarrely, I was on a call this morning, or a video conference as we do these days, with somebody this morning, and actually talking to them about that. And as soon as I said the term the squeezed middle, you could just see their face go, yeah, that's me. Yeah, absolutely, that's me. And they're very successful, in what they're doing at work. They've got a loving family, all those wonderful things. But actually, you can see the weight of pressure that they're carrying every day. And as you read the book, one of the first stories that I introduce is this guy called Ian, who kind of could be anybody in modern corporate life. Is the person who is trying to have it all, and is working on this belief that they can have it all against the definitions of what they think all is. And I think this concept of the pressure we experience and being in the squeeze middle is amplified by the celebrity culture that we live in today. And what I mean by that is, if anybody's on social media and people on Instagram, you'll see this, people on LinkedIn and Facebook, you see this, is that we're constantly bombarded by all these statements telling us how we should live, how we should lead, who we should be. And I think what underpins those statements, and they're often based on people like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Obama or whoever else that people perceive to be the great leaders, is that the belief that underpins it is you too could be the great man. If you do what I do, you could be the great man and you could have it all. And as I talk about in the book, that's a false belief. That doesn't exist. That have it all. I mean, what is all? Because if you look at any one of the individuals that are proclaimed to be great in all their sense, there is vulnerable and magnificent and flawed as the rest of us, and even some of them, they're quite famous characters like Steve Jobs, the commentary you hear about him is really mixed in terms of who he was as a human being and how he treated other human beings. And so I think that the bigger danger about this celebrity culture that we've created within society is it creates this belief that we all need to aspire to be the great man. and aspire to be these people who we are naturally putting on pedestals, and we want to be in a pedestal. But for most of us, who honestly don't really want that, can't see ourselves doing that, don't want to invest the time and energy, or don't actually feel that that's important for us, all that does is help us stay in the shadows of the great man. And I think if anybody's on social media, how many times have you looked at somebody else's life and gone, wow, that's amazing. Look at what that person's doing, when in actual fact, that image is not the reality. And I've heard plenty of stories from people who, know individuals who are quite famous on social media, and tell stories that actually, yes, they have this image of who they are, but that's not the reality. And so for me, the danger in us holding these beliefs about the great man leader, about, perpetuating the celebrity culture that goes with that, is that we hold ourselves in the shadow of the great man. And we hold ourselves in the shadow of the preconceptions of what we should be, as opposed to actually stepping into the light as our full human potential selves, and finding, really clearly, authentically defining who we want to be, and pursuing that. And I think the other part of this that the book really talks about in part one is that, this celebrity culture, this great man theory, it's actually under attack. And this is why I think we should be killing it off in the way that I describe. And it's under attack because of two fundamental things. Number one is the age we are living in now, which I refer to as the age of accelerations, is creating this level of uncertainty in everyday life that is that just means we can't have certainty. We can't, say, right, this is the right answer, this is what we should do, this will lead to us to the utopian place that we all believe that we should be getting to, and which the great man model espouses. And I think if you even reflect on the last 3 months, 4 months, in any way, the concept of having certainty is completely blown out the window. Where every person in a leadership role that I talk to is saying, we were making it up. Whether they were more junior in their business or at the top, they were saying we were making it up. We were taking every day as it comes, trying to make sense of it. And so uncertainty is now the prevailing experience that we're all having to live with, and it's in our face. We can no longer hide from it. The second thing that I think undermines this celebrity culture and the great man model is the fact that we're human beings. We're more demanding of being treated like human beings and being respected for human beings. But actually, in recognizing that we're human beings, we're also recognizing that we are incredibly vulnerable to the uncertainty, to the changes that are happening in the world around us. And if you take climate change as a great example, we're all going to be impacted by that, and we're all impacted by it now, whether that's on a micro level in terms of influencing cost of food or food prices, or various other things that we buy day to day, or actually becoming on the macro level in terms of just the stability and security of nations. We are vulnerable to the impact of the things that are happening around us. And I think that ultimately what that does is it causes us to have this perpetual sense of anxiety, this lived experience of anxiety, which may not be anxiety in the clinical form as many people would describe it and recognizing it, but we all have this sense of unease about what's going to happen next. And as human beings, we don't like that sense of unease. We're not wired to live with uncertainty and to enjoy feeling vulnerable. And I see there's a few authors around at the moment going, we should be vulnerable, that's what we should be showing, etc. We're just not wired that way. We're not wired that way at all. And I don't believe that actually embracing vulnerability in the way that many of them describe is the right path. Instead, what we should be doing is embracing humility, which I'll talk a lot more about as the Great Man is Dead sort of rolls out, and I release more content with it. So ultimately, if it's not one thing that we're demanding more, the world is changing around us, which means the foundations on which the great man once lived and once expressed their power and their sense of what's right, they're all crumbling. And so we need a different model. And ultimately what my book is trying to do is to give us a new, more human philosophy for leadership, but one that's really firmly grounded in who you are and what you're all about as a human being. And so, in that context, for anybody who reads the book, there's a moment in it where you go, "Hang on, this isn't trying to tell me to be a better leader. This is forcing me to look in the mirror, to really consider who am I, why am I here, and how will I lead and live," which is the crux of my theory, the three questions theory. But I think that you can only be effective in looking in the mirror if you take the right reference point. And what I mean by that is that there's a concept within the book which I think is easy to brush over, but actually is more fundamental to modern development theory than we probably expect. And that's this concept of the paradox of self-awareness. Now, I think there's real value in the fact that, a lot of people are saying, people in leadership roles, everyday human beings, we need to develop our self-awareness. We need to build our emotional intelligence. And I firmly believe that there is a continuum of intelligence that we've been developing over the years and will continue to, where the first part is, IQ, which is all about intellect. So to get somewhere in life, you need to be to have a certain level of intelligence, a certain IQ, if you could call it that. Then they recognized that actually that wasn't sufficient. So we also needed to be good at working with other people. So we needed emotional intelligence. So you had IQ and then EQ. And now all of a sudden we've entered into this space where, but that's not enough. Actually, we want meaning and purpose in our life. And so that takes us into the realms of SQ, which is spiritual intelligence, which is saying, actually, why am I here? What am I doing with my time? What is my life's purpose? And I think that what we'll see over, especially through the COVID crisis, because I think that's triggered a massive disruption in society and a massive disruption in terms of our understanding of the world, is that will take us into the fourth level of intelligence, which is what they call cosmic intelligence, which is all about my interconnection with other human beings. And we're seeing that in a very real way in terms of the spread of the virus, etc. But what that brings us back to is this concept of saying, actually, we all should be focused on developing our emotional intelligence, our ability to be reflective of self and to understand how we interact and regulate our behavior with others. And I think that's great. But actually, the problem with that, how it's thrust on many people, is it causes people not to focus on moving into a different definition of self. It forces people just to compare to the great man. And what I mean by that is, for anybody who can see the image on the screen, is that the goal-focused types individuals, and for the people who read the book, you'll see it in the book, are the great man characters. You wonder how they got to the top, because they don't seem to be that self-aware. But the reason they got to the top is because they were able to bulldoze over everybody else, because they weren't really that self-aware and they didn't care about the impact they were having. And we compare ourselves to them because they get to the top of organizations and unfortunately they're the people who have the big houses and the big salaries, etc., etc. I think the vast majority of people I spend time with and I meet are in this over-regulated space of self-awareness. And what I mean by that is that when we think about emotional intelligence, their self-awareness isn't the issue. In fact, it isn't the issue in terms of them not having it. It is the issue in terms of it holding them back. Because what they do is they start to look at themselves in the mirror and then they start to question themselves and they really start to challenge themselves about who they are, why they're not performing the same as everybody else. And in this space is where we so often see imposter syndrome. An imposter syndrome is where people are comparing themselves back to the great man, or who they perceive they should be and who they perceive other people are telling them to be. And they get caught in that belief and start to overregulate their behavior. And the number of people that I spend time with who are just caught in this trap where they're spending so much time being worried about what other people are thinking of them, that they're not actually able to let go and be who they truly can be. And so if we're going to start to look in the mirror, a lot of what the Great Man is about is helping people let go of some of those beliefs, which I'll get onto in terms of the one rule and the three questions, and start to then, with the energy that they create in terms of letting go, they then start to move into the evolving state, which is creating a different definition for who they see in the mirror and who they authentically want to see in the mirror versus who they believe they should be. And then ultimately that takes you into a purposeful state where people are on this journey of constant contemplation and testing of their identity and purpose and their practice for how they lead and live in their lives. and I guess if you purely rely on this concept of, leaders need to be inspiring, leaders need to build their emotional intelligence or be self-aware, I call it, it's building a house on sand. And what I mean by that is that, when I read across the vast number of books or theories on leadership, you read it and go, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Some of it's a bit cliched, some of it's a bit sort of, nonsense. It's very difficult for people to sort of bring all of it together in the way they need to, whilst also having the pressure of a busy day job. But actually, a lot of it makes sense, and I think it's okay. But actually, none of it really helps people build a solid foundation, and a solid foundation in terms of their identity, purpose, and practice for leadership. So who they see in the mirror and being really confident in that person, both in terms of their sense of identity, but also in terms of their sense of purpose and how they bring that to life through their practice, which I'll talk about. And I think that the reason that it doesn't get there, a lot of the classic development around leadership and the models that you see and you espouse, most of which are pretty much still grounded on this great man theory. The number of times you walk into a room where people have been going through some type of leadership training, and the first thing you see is this list of leaders on a wall that, with the people where they've been asked the question, well, who inspires you? And you create this list, and all of a sudden you put the great man, you put him over on a wall on a pedestal, and it just casts a shadow for the rest of the time. Whereas what the Great Man is Dead is all about is actually saying, right, so if we're going to build a stronger foundation for the leadership of people, let's figure out how we do that. And I think the only way you can do that is to really understand how human beings work. And so, the model for describing human beings, I think the iceberg analogy is great. I've kind of looked for other models or tried to create other models, but I think it works, and it works really well. Where it says, above the surface, if a human being's an iceberg, above the surface is behavior, what people say and do. It's often what we react to in the moment. Below the surface then is motive, values, beliefs, fears. And most models stop there, and this is a real fundamental problem with it. And the great man model of leadership, if it's a bit more evolved, we'll talk about leaders needing to be values driven. And absolutely, I think that's right. Leaders need to have clear, strong values. But actually, the number of people I've worked with or spent time with, or in an HR role had the unfortunate task of having to remove from an organisation because they've compromised their values, is quite a significant number. And I can't necessarily blame them for doing that, but actually what you can do is recognise, well, if we're investing so much time and energy in trying to get them to be good leaders and do what we need, the house, why aren't we also building the foundations? And what is causing in those foundations, causing them to compromise their values or display behaviours which are not particularly effective? And that's what I call the human dilemmas. And so if we go back to my story, with the death of my friends, with the exploration into sort of existential philosophy, the thing that I could never make sense of in my early years, in my career, in my development, is I could never make sense of what was truly driving human beings' behaviour. We'd spend all this time and money in organisations trying to get them to do what we need, people in leadership roles or other people. And yet, in the blink of an eye, something would happen and they'd compromise it. And it was far easier for them to display other behaviours than the ones we necessarily needed. And so with the death of my friends and then the birth of my children and the journey that I went on and really understanding existential philosophy, I discovered this wonderful descriptor of human behaviour. And I created the model out of it. And that model is the human dilemmas. And the human dilemmas, which is a large part of part one and then takes you into part two of the book, tells us that there are these inescapable aspects of being human that drive the formation of our motive and the activation of our motive, and then drive the activation of behaviours to fulfil the motive, et cetera, et cetera. And those dilemmas, as you will see in the book, and for those who are on webinar, you'll see on the screen, are a combination of mortality. Whether we like it or not, we are mortal creatures, and that our primary concern is our survival at an individual level. And that it will drive everything else. Whether you relate that back to Maslow's hierarchy or other things, that fundamentally as a human being, I want to survive. I want to survive this moment and other moments. And if you look at some of the lived experience of what's going on, things like COVID have really threatened that, because it's brought our mortality into stark reality for us. We've had to confront it, and the news has been wonderful in terms of giving us daily death counts, and so we cannot escape that sense of mortality that we have. The next human dilemma is one of identity. We are conscious about how we show up. I'll admit, I looked at myself in the mirror before I came on here to say, how do I look? Is that the image that I want to portray? And we are conscious of that every single day. And we are bombarded in every moment about telling us how we should look, how we should show up, what's acceptable to society and what's not. And our sense of identity actually is the second strongest driver of our motive and our behavior, because actually our identity and how we show up influences what tribe we're a part of and whether we're accepted by the tribe or not. And you think back to high school is a wonderful example of this, where you get people segregating into different groups of their interests, and each group has a separate identity, and you still see that in society today. And being within the group and accepted by the group is safe. Not being accepted by the group is dangerous, and so we are conscious of our identity. The third dilemma is meaning. We're meaning-making creatures, and when we can't find the reason for why things happen, we make it up. We talk about it being, Murphy's Law or fate, etc., etc. And when we find meaning or we create meaning for an event, we hold on to it because it gives us a sense of purpose, and it gives us a sense of stability in an unstable world. And then the fourth one is freedom. And freedom is all about saying, actually, I cannot escape my freedom to choose. And whether I like it or not, even not making a choice is still a choice. We used to work with a guy in the Air Force. His philosophy for avoiding a bad decision was just don't make a decision. And strangely, that turned out to be a bad decision for him career-wise, because people didn't believe he was capable of it. And interestingly, I think in the COVID crisis, one of the things that I've heard a lot from leaders in HR roles or in other parts of the business is that the ability for people to make decisions has been thrust upon them in such a way that it's unavoidable, and so they've been exercising their freedom quite consciously. And the thing that wraps all the human dilemmas together is isolation. No matter how close we get to another human being, we're a single isolated human being who has to grapple with this by ourselves and for ourselves, because my identity, my meaning, my purpose is me. It's all about me, as it is for you, all about you. And the only person who can create that meaning for themselves and exercise their freedom and be conscious of their identity is the person in the mirror. And the more we can understand that, the more effective we can be in embracing that. And I think for me, when I recognize the power of this model, and I never cease to be amazed when I work with people using it and using the 3 questions that I'll get to, is that it causes people to think more deeply about their lives and about their existence, about what's really triggering them and driving them. And I think once you can be more honest with yourselves about how the human dilemmas are influencing your behavior, the more honest you can be about yourself in terms of, more honest you can be with yourself about the types of actions you should take to achieve the success and fulfillment you want in life. So with all of that, what do you do with it? Because I appreciate that the human dilemmas model, the story that I've told, this concept of the great man leader being dead, and we need to find a way to step out of the shadows of the celebrities and into the light as ourselves at full potential, is it forces it to say, well, how do I do that? Because that's a pretty daunting thing to do. And so whilst I talk about the great man is dead being, a new philosophy for leadership, I talk about leadership in the fullest extent. So not a corporate leadership role or a leader in a team or a leader of an organization. I'm talking about the leadership of your life. And so for me, the whole theory that Muru espouses and I sort of bring to life through the work that I do is one of 2 simple statements. And the first statement is stop being a leader. And the second statement is start showing leadership. And the concept of encouraging people to stop being a leader is to suggest that actually the term leader has so many connotations and beliefs about what that means that it's instantly stifling for us. It instantly triggers these beliefs about what it's all about and about who we should be. And so for me, I encourage people to stop using the term leader, stop describing themselves as leaders, stop, talking that I need to be a leader, that I am a leader in my organization, and just forget it. Call yourself whatever you like, but don't talk about leader. And as much as I can, I try to avoid the word altogether. What I think you can do, though, with the space that creates, is you can start to show leadership. And showing leadership is about having a more grounded and authentic contribution to the world around you, including to yourself. It's about being honest with yourself about who you are and why you're here, and being honest with yourself about how you're serving that through your day-to-day actions. And I'm not talking about some grand gesture about, life-filled purpose. I'm talking about just each and every day being conscious about how you show leadership to make a contribution to other people. And the way I propose to bring that to life is simply through the one rule, which is stop being a leader. It's kind of no more simple than that. The one rule is all about, being conscious of what definitions you have for leadership, recognizing what helps you and what doesn't, and learning to let some of that go. And by learning to let some of that go, by no longer comparing yourself to others, by no longer, creating a sense of expectation about the identity you should adopt, it gives you headspace to be thinking differently about who you are and how you show up and why you're here. And by doing that, by following that one rule, of stop being a leader, you start to give yourself time and energy and headspace, as I call it, to focus on the three questions. And the three questions are fundamentally about how do I equip myself to better show leadership across every aspect of my life. And so the three questions are really simple. I mean, they're not in any way rocket science, but as I said, they are incredibly powerful. And I've been really curious. It's always a bit daunting when you release a book and you see what reactions people have. I've been really curious as to see how people have engaged with it, and it's hard not to contemplate them in a way that confronts you in your life. And the reason that they're simple is because they're three simple statements. They're not rocket science, but the reason they're powerful is because they tap directly into the human dilemmas. They cut all the way through the iceberg and into the drivers of our human behavior. And so the first question of who am I is all about their identity. It's forcing you to stop and think about, what is the identity I want to adopt? How do I want to project myself in this world? And is that who I authentically want to be? It's not about who I'm told I should be and who I see in the magazines and on social media, etc. It's when I look in the mirror, who's that person that I feel most comfortable with? And how do I just find comfort in being that person? And so by asking who am I, we start to develop a different, more authentic sense of identity for who we are and how we show up in the world. And I always start, I know that Simon Sinek, as an example, says start with why. I get why he says that, and I think that might work and might be relevant for an organization, but for a human being, I don't think you should. I think starting with why is the wrong place. Instead, we should start with who, and I'll explain that. Because I think if you start with why am I here, which is all about a sense of purpose, it's easy to allow the insecurities and hang-ups that you have in your sense of identity. And we all have them, don't get me wrong, that they are a part of who we are and our makeup, and they've been formed over many years. But it's easy to allow those insecurities and hang-ups to influence your sense of purpose. You end up, as I describe it in the book, being like the beauty pageant contest, standing up in front of the crowd saying, so how are you going to use your reign? And you say, well, I'll use my reign to bring world peace. My life's purpose is to bring world peace. And I think for a lot of us, that's just too far beyond us, and not what's really important to us. A lot of the things that are important to us are closer to home. So I think by starting with who am I, you develop a different sense of self. You let go of some of the insecurities and the hang-ups you have that will influence you. And instead what you do is you move to a place of exploring, why are you here? What's the meaning and purpose you have within and for your life? And again, I'm not necessarily talking about some grand life purpose, saying I am this and this is what I'll invest my time and energy in. It's about saying actually what's really important to me and how do I be honest with myself about that, and how do I recognize whether that's where I'm spending my energy, whether it's in each moment, each moment of my day, each moment of my life, or for all moments of my life in terms of the entirety of my existence. And I think the more you start to question that, the more you start to go, hang on, am I investing my time and energy in the things which are most important to me? And the third question, which then links directly into our sense of freedom, is to, well, how will I direct my energy and attention in a more mindful way? And what I mean by that is that if I started creating a different definition for who I am, a more authentic definition for who I am and how I show up, and I'm clear about my sense of identity and purpose in terms of why am I here, then the third question is all about, how will I lead and live? And how will I lead and live is about how will I act with mindful intention. And when I talk to people about the concept of showing leadership, I talk to people about saying this is about being mindful in where I'm directing my energy. And by being mindful, I won't always get it right. We're not perfect human beings, but I will be conscious about when I'm getting it right and when I'm not, when I'm drifting off the path, and so I can bring myself back. And the path is defined by who am I, the first question, and why am I here, the second question. And I think with all of that, what that gives us, when you bind it all together, is this virtuous cycle, virtuous circle of questions that we can then help us remain conscious about, how we are living and leading in any moment or every moment of our lives. And for anybody who reads the book will take you on that journey, and the book will share some stories of others that really bring it to life and force you to consider those questions for yourselves. And I think whether you consider them just at the high level of the top question of who am I, why am I here, and how will I lead and live, or you dig deeper into the content through the sub-questions that go with that, you will naturally start to contemplate different aspects of what your life is all about and how will you lead and live. And so I think to sort of bring this to a bit of a summary, I think the vast majority of people I spend time with are self-aware. They're naturally looking in the mirror. They're naturally asking themselves questions about who they are and what they're all about. And the vast majority of them are really heavily conflicted between, the perceptions and preconceptions of who they think they should be and what they think they should be focused on, and who they authentically want to be. And I think part of that conflict is that they've not properly stopped and considered who they authentically want to be and how they authentically want to show up, etc. And I think that what that creates is this difficult place, as you saw in the paradox of purpose, of where they just cling on to the preconceptions as opposed to letting go and starting that journey of sort of self-discovery and focus on their own sense of sort of leading and living. And I think for the people who are able to spend any time on the three questions and starting to ask who am I, why am I here, and how will I lead and live, I think you get a different sense of self, a different sense of purpose, and a more effective way to lead and live. And as I call it, that to me is about leading and living with greater authenticity in terms of how I show up, greater purpose in terms of knowing what's important to me, my sense of meaning and purpose, and greater mindful intention in terms of where I'm directing my energy. And for the people that I've seen who really embrace this, and some do it quite naturally, some have really used the three questions to help them, it's caused them to operate differently, to invest their time and energy in life differently. And they start this journey of continual contemplation and development, as opposed to feeling like there is some type of utopian state that they're trying to get to as promised by the great man. And so for me, if I can leave the people who are joining this or watching this later on with anything, it's the three questions. They are incredibly simple, but incredibly powerful. And the more that you can spend time thinking about them, the more that you can find a greater sense of comfort in your own skin, a greater sense of purpose, and a greater sense of intention about where you direct your energy. So please feel free to raise any questions or thoughts, anything I can answer using the various elements of the technology. The Great Man is Dead is out. It's live. It's on the usual channels of Amazon, and it's in Kindle and some of the other bookstores. As of the 2nd of July, the Audible version, the audiobook, is still to be released. It's on its way. Hopefully in the next couple of days that will be launched. But please, I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to take it and use it for what it's intended to be. It's not intended to be a classic leadership book in terms of forcing you to learn from the stories of others. It's forcing you to actually look in the mirror and start to think about your own life and your own leadership in the fullest extent of your life slightly differently. And I guess, Mirror Leadership and the work that I do, doing really interesting work with a range of leaders and a range of organizations who are really looking to bring to life a new, more human approach to how they focus on people and development. So please feel free to follow us on any of the various social media channels we're on, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And please feel free to reach out directly. I'd be happy to talk about this concept a lot more. For me, what Mirror is all about, it's not a business per se. It's a vehicle to really help people, be all they can be, to help people unlock their own potential in terms of how they lead and live in their own lives, and help them unlock the potential of others so they can have that impact to help really enrich the lives of others as well. So on that note, thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, please fire them through. My details are on the website, and I'd be happy to help anybody who might need it. Thank you very much. Take care.